Welcome to the Bob Unger Show. We're very privileged today to have as our guest Tony Lyons, who is the CEO of Skyhorse Publishing, a publishing company that actually believes in freedom of speech. What a concept. You know, as you know, they edited out Bobby Kennedy's interview. I think it was on ABC News.
Yes.
And when somebody took them to task for it, they said it was because it was disinformation. So here you have the media, which is supposed to be about free speech, editing out somebody's words.
Yeah, I mean, that was such an incredible breach of journalistic ethics. I mean, to have somebody on your show and then to decide which parts of it you don't like and edit those out, and then bookend it with disclaimers when you have the opportunity to discuss any of those things with the person who you're interviewing. So, you know, that's a ridiculous form of journalism when you're bringing somebody on your show under false pretenses, telling them that it's a real interview, where you're just going to pick it apart and decide what you want to show. And then even then, you're going to have these disclaimers of, you know, everything's settled, science is over, we have reached the end of science, there's no reason to question anything, just go to the CDC website and you'll get all the answers to everything. I mean, it's just such an absurd historical moment that—
Well, Tony, your company, in contrast to that, has published books such as The Case for Masks, and then you've also published The Case Against Masks, because you believe in publishing anything that is well written and has an audience. And you don't necessarily have to agree with any of your authors. It's a question is, what kind of writing is involved? Obviously, if the person can't write a sentence, you're not going to publish their book. But if a person can write a book that is well written, makes a cogent argument, you're not going to decide whether he's right or whether he's wrong. A publisher's job is to put the book out there and let the audience decide what they think is right and wrong.
Right. I mean, we purport to live in a democracy, you know, and in this kind of country where we, you know, go after Russia and China and all these other countries where there's, you know, terrible censorship and propaganda, we have the right to expect that we're not going to have that here. So, you know, I have a publishing company and I'm not in the propaganda business. So I don't just pick and choose a very specific point of view and then try to ram that down people's throats. You know, when you're dealing with adults in a democracy, they're allowed to hear all the different points of view and then they sort it out for themselves, right? They don't need AI to do it for them. They don't need TV shows that do it for them. They don't need newspapers that just republish, you know, PR sheets from the government. We need real information so that we can try to sort it out for ourselves.
Well, as I think I told you, Dr. Robert Malone, who's an MD and a PhD, which is even more impressive, his book, Lies My Government Told Me, was interviewed by me and by Dr. Alan Katz, who's been a doctor for more than 42 years, and YouTube banned it.
Sure.
So,
yeah, I mean, it's a crazy time when you think about the fact that it's not about somebody's credentials. Why are things being banned? They're being banned because they go against a very specific narrative. So we are actually living in 1984 right now, where they're not even people making these decisions. They're bots that are looking for specific narratives that go against what they've decided is the truth. And, you know, that's an incredible thing, and it's a scary thing, and it's something that we all need to fight against, because we don't want a future where the only speech you can get is speech that's approved by the government.
Yeah, well, now they want to jail people. You actually see United States senators talking about jailing people for what they call irresponsible speech, which means anything they don't agree with.
But the COVID period is such a great example of that, that it's almost comical, because all of these people who got censored for disinformation, even the people on the disinformation dozen, which by the way was created by an organization that doesn't even really, it's not even a real organization. It has a location in Washington and one in the UK, but there are no employees that I can tell. Their PO box numbers, yet they were cited. The disinformation dozen was cited in hundreds and hundreds of newspapers and magazines and TV shows. And the people who were on it were vilified because it looked like some big organization had done research and they were really doing bad things. But when you look at these people, when you look at the claims that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was making in 2021, or the claims that Dr. Mercola was making in 2021, or for that matter, the claims that that so many other doctors were making at the time, most of them have been proved correct in all of the major claims that they made. So the New York Times ran all these hit pieces. All these people were kicked off YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. They were deplatformed on Google in the sense that you couldn't find them. If they wrote books, their books were often taken down from all major platforms. And when they weren't taken down, they were minimized in this sort of insidious censorship method that Amazon has come up with, where they have a sort of a disclaimer that's like a warning, sending people to the CDC website. But that seems relatively simple. But what's really happening is they're using a whole bunch of methods to make it less likely that you'll find that. So almost anything that you go online to search for now on Amazon or anywhere else, if you look for something, it then recommends all kinds of other things. And if you look at it once, it recommends it back to you. But if you look up Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book on Amazon, it will never recommend it to you. If you look up with any similar book, it will never be recommended to you. If you even look in your recent searches, you will find that it'll show you 3 other books that you looked for the day before. It'll show you the toilet paper that you bought the day before, but it will not show you Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book. So they are using every big tech kind of method they can use. And one of the things people have said is, well, the book still sold more than 1 million copies. So what are you complaining about? And my position there is that that was a book that was about to change the world. It was a book that had a 50,000 copy day, and then it had a 20,000 copy day, and then multiple 10,000 copy days. And then the wrath of Dr. Fauci and the wrath of the government came down on it. And they used all of these methods, and they even wrote a document that came out right around then from the Surgeon General that was talked all about confronting health misinformation, that showed all the methods they were going to use to make it harder for that information to get out there. So I think that book and the information in it was going to change the world. It was going to get to 10 million or 20 million people. And that was going to mean real change. That was going to mean policy change, where the government couldn't have gotten away with a lot of the things they were doing. So I think people actually died because of the censorship of that book and Dr. Mercola's book and Dr. Joe Ladapo's book and Ed Dowd's book and Dr. Malone's book and Dr. McCullough's book. I mean, all of these books were knocked down. So they all sold reasonably well, and the people are still out there. But it was just not at all clear what would have happened. And to me, it's perfectly clear that those books and those people would have just gone viral. And the world, if they had got those messages, would have responded to it. So that's what I think was prevented by government action. It was absolutely unconstitutional. They were writing letters. They were threatening big tech companies. They were installing people in big tech companies. So it was this concerted effort to change the thinking of everybody in this country. So, I mean, I even have trouble blaming people for the things that they did wrong, because I think that they were subjected to just an incredible propaganda campaign, a propaganda campaign that would have been the envy of any dictator in the history of the world. The power now is just so strong. So I think that it's a miracle that all of these people, and they had to really believe strongly in what they were saying, because all of these people have really suffered. They've lost their friendships, their jobs, their board seats, their future. So many things they've given up because they can't do anything else, because they just feel that they can't live in a world where they can't express what they really believe.
Well, it's ironic that they accuse people like Bobby Kennedy and Edwin Dowd and McCullough and Mercola of being responsible for the deaths of a myriad of people from COVID, from their disinformation. They're killers. Just like the Nazis said about the Jews, they're spreading all kinds of infections, and they have to be isolated and they have to be dealt with. And ironically, these people, you can turn that argument around and said if more people would have read Bobby Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci, and understood that this guy is not a god, he's a demagogue, or read Edwin Dowd's book, Cause Unknown, they may have questioned whether they should just accept everything they're being told. And that could have saved many lives, as opposed to us.
I mean, when in the history of pandemics have there been quarantines of healthy people, or quarantines of a whole segment of the population that was not at risk? I mean, there are all kinds of parts of this COVID story that don't make any sense. So there's the Sweden side, where they just let kids go to school, and the outcome was the same, if not better. So there was no danger there. There was no danger to young, healthy children in the United States. And there is a danger to getting vaccinated for young, healthy men, as Dr. Joe Latipo proved in a study that he did in Florida. He's the Surgeon General of Florida. He had access to all of that data, and he used it to prove that 18 to 39-year-old healthy men actually had a much worse outcome if they got vaccinated than if they didn't get vaccinated. So the world was just shutting down for one purpose only, and that purpose was to help these incredibly powerful companies maximize their return on investment. And they have so clearly captured the agencies that are supposed to be regulating them. And as Bobby Kennedy said on ABC News last night, the interviewer was asking him, so are you telling me that all of these agencies are corrupt? And he gave a great answer. What he said was that 90% of the people working at those places are honest, hardworking, patriotic Americans trying to do the right thing. But the people who rise to the top are the people who play ball. So they're the people who are corrupt, who are making deals that are going to get them jobs after they leave, or are taking kickbacks in some sense, that they're getting portions of patents, and then they approve whatever the product is based on that patent, or they're just getting more power. So for Fauci, it seems like it was a big sort of combination of things that he was trying to get. One, he was just trying to get more power. Then two, he was trying to get more money. Then three, he was really just enjoying that control. And he was part of this kind of cabal that just wanted to control the whole world, and were enjoying that opportunity, which is a certain kind of a sickness. But
oh, absolutely. He's an egomaniac, a megalomaniac, a narcissist. But Bobby Kennedy, in his speech in Boston, where he announced that he's running for president, he talked about what you just alluded to, agency capture.
Right.
This is the concept that when you have enough money, as these major corporations like Pfizer have, you can literally buy any government agency you want. And
Right.
we've seen this because people are constantly going from the government into the corporate world, back into the government. The same thing happens in journalism. People work for the New York Times, then they go work for the government, then they go back to the New York Times, and we constantly see this. It's like a mafia protection racket.
Right.
If the mafia says they're going to put a cart through my window in my office building, if I don't pay them, they have the power to do that. So I have to pay them. But the point I would make to Bobby Kennedy is innately, inherently, as the founding fathers understood, you can't put that kind of power in the hands of any government, because sooner or later somebody will buy them. So what you need is a very, very tiny government that cannot be all things to all people, that cannot give everybody what they want. All the government can do is provide a fair playing field, like an umpire in a baseball game, and then let the principals compete. Once you have government, you are not going to reform them, because it is inherently evil to have that kind of power. The famous quote from Lord Acton, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
And once you cede that power to the government, it's hard to get it back. Once you give up rights, it's easy to give up rights. It can take almost no time. It can take, as we've seen, 3 years where we've given up so many of our rights for what we believed in some sense was safety. Now, I don't believe that we got anything in that deal, but so many millions of people gave up their rights, and it's going to be hard to get them back because, governments and big corporations, they don't give those rights back quickly. When they get something, they hold on to it because it's a license to print money, and that's what they want. And it's a license to have power over you forever and to have more and more power. So, I would say that people ought to think about the fact that, they believe that they're living in a democracy in the United States, and that, like I said before, Russia and China are these controlled countries where people don't have any freedom. But, there is some kind of freedom in knowing what kind of country you live in. So Chinese people know that their government is censoring them. They know that the government is using propaganda against them all the time. So they get an opportunity then to think through what's happening and to try to counteract it and try to somehow get a hold of books and of information. And what's happening in this country is that we're losing all of our rights, and so many people have no idea, and they're proud of it, and they think this is the greatest country on earth. We have more freedom than anybody else. But, so are we living in a democracy now, or are we living in a corporate kleptocracy where it's just a process of extracting money from people? So one of the things Bobby Kennedy also said in his speech is that the last 3 years was, the biggest transfer of wealth in the history of mankind, where you sort of gutted the whole middle class. So that now, according to the New York Times, and I think that they're trustworthy on a very small percentage of things that they publish, but this was probably one of them, where they said that basically 40 or 50% of the people in this country couldn't get their hands on $1,000 to pay off some sort of medical bill that was unexpected. So, you've got 120 million people or more than that. I mean, probably 120 million adults in this country that are just living at the subsistence level. So we've actually, as a country, even though maybe our gross national product goes up, the average person in this country, their relative wealth is going down and down and down, and the wealth of the top 1% or the top 2% is going up and up. So, that's what's really scary, is that people don't see what's going on, and you can't fight something if you can't see it. And so, like the government racket or the mafia racket that you described before, the government is claiming that they're trying to help us get rid of misinformation or disinformation. And Biden, wanted to create this special kind of branch of government that was going to be tasked with making sure we could get good, trustworthy information, which was such an incredible joke because they had been working for the 2 years before that to make sure that we couldn't get information, to stifle dissent of every kind. And then they realized, well, maybe this is bad because coming out and saying that we're going to do this makes people angry. And we're doing it anyway. So we should say that we're not going to do it like we were doing before so that we can continue to get away with it. And, that's what is really scary, that we need people to wake up and recognize what's happening and kind of get angry about it and recognize that when they turn on the TV set, they're going to get what they got with Bobby Kennedy yesterday. And that actually was the best that they will get, because they did get a lot of good content from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., where he sincerely, countered the statements they were making, where he said things that were really important for people to hear. And they tried to minimize it and disclaim it and cut it down in any way they could. But some good information got out. Whereas, as he said in his speech, he's had 18 years of being censored. I mean, the last 3 years were the worst. But, he said now he's going to have 18 months where they're going to have to put him on some shows and, they're going to treat him badly, but they're going to have to put him out there to some extent because he's running for president of the United States.
Well, that's why you got to give some credit to Tucker Carlson, because Tucker Carlson had him on. And, it doesn't matter whether I love Tucker Carlson or I don't like him. He gave him the opportunity, gave him a fair hearing, and that's all you could ever ask of any journalist, that you get a fair hearing. That's all.
Yeah, well, there's a reason that 35% of Tucker Carlson's viewers were Democrats. So it's on Fox News, but you got 35% of the people, more than 1 million people tuning in to his show. It was because it was interesting, it was heartfelt, it wasn't controlled. So Tucker came out and he had anybody on who he wanted, and he said anything that he wanted, and it was uncensored. And he said very clearly a couple of years ago, I'm going to keep on doing it my own way, but in the short run, they're probably going to win. I was watching him say this. It was on a bunch of shows where it was reproduced, but it was fascinating because he knew this would happen at some point, and his position was he was just going to do it his way for as long as he could. And then he thought he was going to lose the Googles of the world that are shutting down, that are sort of siphoning information and sort of molding it and pushing you towards a certain result, which is even worse now with ChatGPT. He thought they were going to win, but only in the short run. And so one of the things that he was really able to do well is he opened the minds of so many different people, which is why his was the only really bipartisan show, right?
That's right.
That's amazing. That one of the things that Bobby Kennedy talks about, in that speech, is that he wants to bridge the divide. That we can't have two Americas. We can't have a president who's only talking to half of the country, and then we switch over and we have another president who's only talking to half. We need leaders who can talk to everybody. And like you said before, you're not going to agree with them on everything, but you want to be able to trust them, and you want to be able to trust what they say, and you want them to uphold the Constitution and to allow really diversity of speech, because that's the most important kind of diversity. So we hear all day long about every other kind of diversity, but what could be more important than the diversity of ideas?
That's right. So let's talk about the first book we mentioned was Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s book, The Real Anthony Fauci. And that book, I mean, I read that book, and so did my friend, Dr. Katz. I mean, that book is an encyclopedia of knowledge. And you notice he hasn't gotten sued. I mean, some of the people he talks about, like Fauci, they can certainly afford a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. I know what it takes to sue somebody. And yet they don't sue him, which tells you right away that what he's saying is valid. Then you have Edwin Dowd, who was managing $17 billion at BlackRock and saw what he was in the middle of and saw what was happening with the COVID shutdowns. And so he wrote the book Cause Unknown, which you also publish. And that shows that the excess mortality, in other words, deaths outside of what would be normally expected, are happening to the healthiest segments of our population post-jab, kids, athletes, you name it, all suppressed. You don't read about it in any mainstream publication because they do what they did to Bobby Kennedy yesterday. They just take it out. And then you also have, you've published books by Alan Dershowitz. I'm not a big fan of his, so we'll just mention that you do publish his books. He's a very well-known author, and he's a bright guy. But I don't like his position on forcing people to be stabbed and pulling them out of their house to do it.
But you know what I do like with him is that he was one of the few people, one of the few public figures who was willing to debate Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Yes, that's true.
So you
That's
look
true.
out there and you say, well, who else was willing to do that? So Bobby Kennedy came out and he said it loudly, time after time, to anybody who would listen. He even came out and said that he would pay $100,000 to anybody who proved him wrong on the things that he said in The Real Anthony Fauci, and nobody would debate him. So if you're telling the truth, you don't need these censorship tools. You don't need propaganda. You don't need government lies. You know, you can just go on television. I mean, Dr. Fauci had all the power in the world. If he really had the better argument, he'd have just made it. He didn't have to go on television and say 20 times that if you disagree with him, you disagree with science itself. You know, that's not what science is. And any intelligent adult knows that that's not science. Science is messy. Science is never static. Everything that people learned in medical school 40 years ago has been changed. There's more nuance. Some of it was just totally wrong. So, you know, all of the medical books from 60 years ago, 70 years ago, they're strewn with errors. And all of the medical books now are also strewn with errors. We just don't know what they are yet. And we're going to learn those if we have real dialogue. But, you know, some of the main journals, some of the main scientific journals have come out and said that even their own journals are not trustworthy. You know, that what's happening now is that most of the science that makes it through is either from captured agencies or it's funded by the corporations that are going to make money off a certain result. So they do everything they can to get to that result. And if you look at the transcripts of the Vioxx trials, where, you know, something like 50,000 people, maybe many more, died unnecessarily of heart attacks, you know, you come to a conclusion that is really, really scary. And that's that the science that's being done now isn't being done to get to scientific truth or to get to a closer approximation of the truth, that the science is being done to make more money. And that's it. And so that kind of science is the end of the science. That kind of science, you know, really represents a kind of 1984 view of what our future is. That the only things that are going to be discovered or disclosed are things that.
You there?
Yeah, I think I lost you for a little while.
For a second, yeah. Okay, let's talk about, we've got about 6.5 minutes to go. Let's talk about Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s new book on the Wuhan lab that you're.
Yeah, so this is a fantastic book. It's called The Wuhan Cover-Up. And you know what this really shows is that there's been this whole history of bioweapons research in this country, and that there's been this sort of coordination between Dr. Fauci, the NIAID, the CDC, the FDA, and the Chinese government. So after gain-of-function research was, you know, rightly stopped in the United States because of leaks in this country close to Washington, D.C., that there was some fear built up there. And they basically said, we're just not going to allow this kind of research in this country. So they did what they often do when people have too much power. And that is, they said, well, the president can't tell me what to do. Congress can't tell me what to do. I'm just going to find a way to do it anyway. So they shipped this idea, this gain of function research, to Wuhan. And it seems very clear now that they were doing research into coronaviruses there. That's exactly where the, you know, either a lab leak or some other kind of coronavirus started. So if you think about it, how would you know right away? How would you be sure right away that it wasn't just a lab leak? So if you look at Dr. Fauci's emails, if you look at the whole history of bioweapons research in this country, you will see that they were never going to tell us if that's the way it happened. So what this book does is, this is a 500-page book that details the whole history leading up to this moment and how it happened, why the government wasn't forthright. And, you know, hopefully what this book leads to is congressional investigations that get to the bottom of it and that land Dr. Fauci in prison so that, you know, somebody pays for what happened to so many people all around the world.
Yeah, it's very interesting how life works. You know, Bobby Kennedy was an environmental lawyer, and he made his living suing companies for polluting. But in that process, it seems to me, he learned a lot of science. And now he's using the science not just to be a litigation lawyer, he's using the science to save lives with his knowledge. And it's funny how that one thing led to the other, because he's got an amazing knowledge of science. And I can recognize it because even though my wife's a PhD in science, I am the worst when it comes to science, even though I went to Bronx High School of Science. But I'm terrible in science. I was lucky during those days. But, you know, his knowledge is unbelievable. Reading The Real Anthony Faucci, incredible book.
Yeah, I mean, he has been reading science for these kinds of lawsuits for 40 years. So he's been going up against the most powerful people in this country for all of that time. And he's been totally consistent, which is that he just tries to get to the bottom of a problem. He tries to get to the bottom of the corporate greed and the government corruption and the collusion between the corporations and the government agencies. And he follows it wherever it goes. And he gets no benefit from it. He isn't doing it to get ahead himself. He just wants to get to the truth. And, you know, something that, you know, many people look at him and they say, well, he's changed in recent years. When I look at him, I see a career that's absolutely consistent. that he was going after the same kinds of people, even though they're different kinds of companies and they're different agencies of the government. But, you know, he was focused before on the external environment, meaning outside of our own bodies. So it was a very logical transition then to say, well, if you care about everything outside of the body, wouldn't you also care about what's going into the body and the things that are happening in the body, which would then involve, you know, mercury in a vaccine. So if you care about mercuries in, you know, in the water or mercury in the air, wouldn't you care about mercury that's being, you know, shot into young babies? You know, so if you care about any other kinds of chemicals in the water or in the air or in food, wouldn't you really care that those same chemicals were one way or another being put into the body? So I think he's been consistent all along that he may be the world's last honest politician, that if he became president, he's absolutely uncorruptible. And I don't think there's a single politician you can point to. I mean, if you look at, there was a great video that I watched about a week ago that had something like a dozen Republican senators and a dozen Democratic senators, and how much money they had when they started in public service and how much money they had 30 years later. So many of them went from $1 million to $130 million. So they're all part of this. They have different views, but they're taking from the people, not giving to them.
Tony of Skyhorse Publishing, we got a few seconds left. All I can say is that people who believe in freedom, whether it's coming from the far right like me, or coming from the left like Naomi Wolf or Matt Taibbi, all of us, we have to stick together or we will hang separately. God bless.